This video is made possible by Blinkist. Do you manage to read all the books you want to, get all the knowledge you need? Well, probably not, right? Everyone is busier than ever. It's harder than ever to spend time learning. And even when you try, there are so many distractions, like that tempting video about some nonsense over there on the right. Or maybe it's the opposite right now. You're stuck at home due to the coronavirus, and the thought of going to a library or browsing a bookshop seems a bit too risky. Or you might think that you don't have enough time to read. Well, good news. Even if you don't, you do if you use Blinkist. Blinkist is an app that takes the best insights and need-to-know info from thousands of non-fiction books and condenses them into 15-minute summaries which you can read or listen to. They have a huge library and 14 million users. 14 million! The team at VisualPolitik are ideal Blinkist customers. We find we can actually fit reading a book through Blinkist into a break time or a commute to a shoot while still keeping up with a pretty crazy work schedule. They've got tons of popular titles like Thinking, Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman. Also, tons of political books, and if you want to take a look back at the history, they've got great condensed versions of books like The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. The first 100 people to go to blinkist.com/visualpolitik are going to get unlimited access for 1 week to try it out. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. Move fast, get started on catching up on all those great books that you haven't got round to reading. The 7-day trial is completely free, and you can cancel at any time during that trial if you're not completely into it, but I'm sure you will be. (1979) was a difficult year. In that year, Iran's Islamic Revolution and the seizure of the United States Embassy in Tehran took place. In Afghanistan, after a series of assassinations, including that of the United States ambassador himself and a coup d'etat, the Soviet Union began its armed intervention by deploying thousands and thousands of men, tanks, and all kinds of military equipment to Afghan soil. Also in 1979, Saddam Hussein came to power. There was the occupation of the Great Mosque of Mecca that put the Saudi Arabian royal family up against the ropes. And to top it off, the signing of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt served to infuriate the Arab world. And as if all that weren't enough, Iran's Islamic Revolution caused oil production in Iran, at the time one of the world's largest crude oil producers, to collapse by about 75%. 75%! Something which I'm sure you can imagine led to an immediate energy crisis around the entire planet. In just a few months, the price of oil soared by 150%. Inflation and unemployment skyrocketed throughout the Western world, and fuel shortages caused Americans to wait hours in long queues just to be able to fill up their gas tanks. Suddenly, Americans understood that the distant Persian Gulf was essential, imperative, absolutely key to the health and stability of the world economy. And at the time, things looked so bad that in 1980, US President Jimmy Carter, and remember this is a president known mostly for not wanting to know anything about military interventions, was forced to take action. In his State of the Union address in January 1980, Carter proclaimed that the United States would use whatever force was necessary to safeguard the oil fields in the Persian Gulf. It is what became known as the Carter Doctrine. Of course, at the time, the Soviet Union was first and foremost in his mind. In Washington, they were terrified that the Soviet Empire, which at the time was bordering Iran and also had thousands of combat troops deployed in Afghanistan, would take advantage of the chaos to invade that region.
This situation demands careful thought, steady nerves, and resolute action, not only for this year, but for many years to come. It demands collective efforts to meet this new threat to security in the Persian Gulf and in Southwest Asia.
And since then, all US presidents, both Democrats and Republicans alike, have adopted the Carter Doctrine as their own. Since it was launched, this policy was perhaps the most important item on the US foreign agenda, and one of the critical elements on which international order is based. Don't forget that we're talking about a strategy, a policy that has resulted in endless military interventions. These include Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval escort operative since World War II, to the First Gulf War, Operation Desert Fox, and the Iraq War, among dozens and dozens of operations. It is also this same Carter Doctrine that explains the United States having more than 55,000 combat units permanently deployed in the Middle East, according to data collected by the Washington Post. We are talking about a mammoth deployment that includes intelligence units, special operation groups, bomber squadrons, and, for example, the US Navy Fifth Fleet, a fleet led by the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower and consisting of more than 20 warships and more than 15,000 soldiers. Since mid-2019, this presence in the Gulf even includes the jewel of the US Air Force, the F-22 Raptor. Yet, despite such an arsenal being poised and ready to face all-out war, the truth is that the Obama administration in its second term, and particularly the Trump administration, have tried to end this Carter Doctrine once and for all. Why? We've talked about this a lot here on VisualPolitik. Thanks to the fracking revolution, the Persian Gulf is apparently no longer as important to the world economy as it was just a few years ago. But you know what? When it comes to the truth, the United States has come up against a harsh reality. All signs indicate that its Arab allies are unable to ensure stability in this region of the world. And that's something that makes us sit up and take notice when we consider that Gulf petro monarchies have been spending real fortunes on their armed forces for years. For example, Saudi Arabia alone has spent more than $300 billion on its armed forces over the past 5 years. Year after year, Saudi Arabia is the third-ranking country in the world for having the largest military, behind only the United States and China. And of course, it's not just about Saudi Arabia. The rest of the Arab Gulf countries also spend a real fortune on their armies. To get an idea, the United Arab Emirates has a military budget equivalent to that of Israel. However, despite all the tens and tens of billions of dollars that petro-monarchies spend every year on their armed forces, every time something happens, we always end up encountering news like this.
October 2019. Trump is sending more troops to Saudi Arabia. Foreign policy.
And it's at this point that two questions need to be asked. Why do Gulf sheikhs spend so much money on their armed forces? And more importantly, what on earth is going on that these forces continue to be so inept? Friends, Saudi Arabia has one of the largest and most expensive armies on the planet. It's the most significant buyer of US weaponry. And yet, when it comes to the crunch, a simple drone strike is able to bring the kingdom to its knees. Let's not even get started about defending the sea lanes in the Strait of Hormuz. For those of you who don't know, the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow strip of water through which about 1/5 of all oil production in the world passes every day. Almost 20 million barrels of oil. That is, we are talking about the main artery, the most important artery in the economic systems of all Arab countries. The place where their crude oil exports pass through, and therefore the path for converting their oil into the coveted petrodollars. Well, despite this, and the tens and tens of thousands of millions of dollars spent each year on their armed forces, it is not clear that they were even able to keep this passage open. But what is the reason for such a disaster? How is it possible that so much money is spent, and yet they are not even able to protect the route that guarantees their immense wealth? Well, we can find at least 3 reasons for such abject failure. Listen up.
Very sticky fingers.
Let's be honest, defense spending is often the most patriotic and at the same time, the most opaque and touchy part of all budgets for the vast majority of governments. According to Transparency International estimates, more than $20 billion each year disappears due to corruption linked to the military industry. And you know what? It's not that surprising. Think about it for a moment. Military equipment purchases are made from very few manufacturers, so competition is reduced. Contracts are arbitrarily decided by just a few people, and it's very easy to justify virtually any move with 2 magic words: national security. As you can see, we are looking at the perfect breeding ground for corruption. And you may be surprised, but scientific studies seem clear. There is a direct correlation between military spending and corruption. Of course, not all places are the same. The more opaque the institutions in a particular country, the greater the impact these issues will have. And I'm sure no one will be surprised to hear that in this matter, the petro-monarchies in the Persian Gulf take first prize. With the exception of Kuwait, which more or less has a relatively operational parliament. In these countries, the making of any government decision, and especially those related in military spending, is absolutely dependent on the royal families. In practice, these countries are managed as family estates, and that makes the institutions very opaque, and with very limited scope to control. If you have influence and are well connected, you're in the perfect situation to fill your pockets with public contracts. In a way, this explains why it is that, in these countries, the acquisition of weapons has usually been accompanied by enormous overpricing and kickbacks, bribes, and the greasing of palms that have filled the pockets of many princes and high authorities.
Defense-related projects are highly secretive and subject to no Ministry of Finance oversight or controls. Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal.
One of the most famous cases was that of Prince Bandar bin Sultan, former Saudi ambassador to Washington and former head of the Saudi intelligence service. As has been disclosed, this prince bought an entire village and 800 hectares of land in an area of central England with the money he received in bribes for his part in a mega contract signed in 1985 to buy the Tornado fighter bomber, a contract that in 20 years put a total of more than £40 billion in the coffers of the British military aircraft manufacturer BAE Systems. We are talking about the biggest agreement to sell military equipment in UK history, a contract which more than £6 billion in bribes could have been paid, according to sources in the British press itself. That is, more than $12 billion in bribes. In fact, Prince Bandar himself was pretty clear about the matter. Listen closely to the statements he made in 2001.
If you tell me that building this whole country out of 400 billion that we misused or got 50 billion, I'll tell you, yeah, so what? We did not invent corruption. This has happened since Adam and Eve. It's human nature. Prince Bandar.
Another example is that of Prince Miteb bin Abdullah, who is suspected to have diverted a few $1 billion, just some small change, from the Saudi National Guard. To divert the money, he hired phantom employees and used them to pay real fortunes to buy equipment from companies that he owned. For example, the purchase of walkie-talkies. Come on! Walkie-talkies with a price tag similar to that of a Mercedes S-Class? Can you imagine? What a deal. Straight to your pocket, of course. But wait a minute, don't think just for a moment that these princes were just a couple of isolated cases. Not at all. Perhaps these two cases illustrate a special kind of greed, but the truth is that it is a fairly common practice. In fact, this explains why the countries of the Persian Gulf are among those with the worst results in Defense Integrity Index developed by Transparency International. But that's not the end of it. No, there's still more.
Question of diplomacy.
Look at this headline.
For the Gulf states, diplomacy involves buying weapons they don't need, The Economist.
Back in 2018, when the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia announced the blockade on Qatar, this country's air force was almost a joke. However, do you know what one of the first things the Qatari government did to respond to this blockade was? Nothing less than signing more than $20 billion in contracts to buy nearly 100 new aircraft from 3 different countries, the American F-15, the French Rafale, and European Eurofighters. Qatar did not even have enough pilots to operate this new air force, a new combat force larger than that of most European countries. You see, Gulf petro monarchies have a common practice, spending a fistful of petrodollars on new military toys every time they want to improve their international relations. And the truth is, it's not such a foolish plan. After all, the military industry only sells to governments, so its marketing campaigns are basically aimed at lobbying. And the Arab sheikhs are very clear about it. What better way to win the support of a bunch of politicians than to use the resources of the military industry? In this way, petro-monarchies not only buy equipment they don't need or that is overpriced, they sometimes buy non-compatible equipment from different sellers. For example, in the case we have seen of Qatar, buying the F-15s, Rafale, and Eurofighters will mean having to train their pilots in 3 different combat systems, stocking up on spare parts for the various aircraft, and having to develop different processes for the maintenance and use of each of the models. Which doesn't make sense. Not only does it make the budget more expensive, but it undermines combat capacity. But what difference does it make? Fundamentally, the purpose of the contract had as much to do with public relations as it did with defense.
It's all about control.
Friends, there is still a third factor that explains why Arab armies are often so expensive and at the same time so inoperative. This factor has a lot to do with control and what the International Institute for Strategic Studies calls the brightness factor. That is, to take on the most expensive, most modern, and most striking weapons to reinforce the popularity of governments among the people, to feed national pride, and ultimately to act as a highly visible element of deterrence to their enemies. Then there's also the issue of the arms race. The first goal of Arab monarchies is to protect themselves, so armies have to be very well controlled. In other words, if you're an Arab sheikh, you don't necessarily want the best army, but a very loyal army. And for that, it takes three things. To keep the military happy and feeling that you take them into account, what better way than to give them the latest equipment, pay them well, and make sure that the officers remain loyal. Therefore, in these countries, military careers are not about choosing the best candidates, but the most submissive or those closest to power. That is why high-ranking commanders tend to be chosen from certain circles or clans particularly close to those of the royal family. Even so, the applicants are subjected to an investigation not only for their background, but also the background of their family. Then, once chosen, they are paid very well. For example, a colonel's monthly salary in the United Arab Emirates is just over $27,000 per month, tax-free. And if they also travel abroad, then they get paid an additional $1,000 for each day that they spend outside the country. Once you've chosen them and then paid them very well, then you give them the best toys to keep them entertained. And that's it, you're all set. Friends, as you can see, in many cases, the armies in these Arab countries have been built on very weak foundations, where military effectiveness was the least important factor. And that explains precisely why they're so expensive and at the same time, so defective. Now, when the time of reckoning arrives, which armies are best prepared for confrontation? The Iranian army or those armies from Arab petro monarchies? Well, that is something that we'll examine in an upcoming video, so don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik. In any case, despite everything that has happened over the last few years, there has been one country that has made a huge leap forward in terms of the preparation of its armed forces. A country that is even being dubbed the Arab Sparta. We talked about it here in this past video here on VisualPolitik. But now, has the story of armies and petrodollars been interesting for you? Well, if it has been, give us a like. I really hope you enjoyed this video.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.